Okay, here is another paper by Michael. This is a piece of joint work by Mike Fan Cai, a Chinese economist, and myself. And this is about the TPP, and Mike touched on it somewhat. By the way, I will talk about the China issue because I think it is very important how it fits into this picture. It may have been, one might have thought that the organizers putting a paper on trade policy at the end of a long day of seminars might be a mistake, because trade policy, or particular trade agreements, tend to be mind-numbing subjects. This, though, is a very interesting agreement, and I want to make the case for why it is, and you'll see some of the issues. It is a tiny agreement. As you will see, this initial TPP negotiation now going on. It's very complicated, and it's not at all clear that it's going to happen. And I know that the United States has a lot at stake. President Obama wants to be able to say something down the road from here at the Hawaii Convention Center in November, but it's not at all clear. In fact, I would say it's very high probability that he will not be able to announce a formal, really completed agreement as of November. So why is it so exciting? By the way, it has now gotten several mentions in Obama's State of the Union addresses. It caused a political scandal in New Zealand from a WikiLeaks cable that had the New Zealand negotiator saying this is really not a very big deal, but I have to sell it as a big deal at home in order to make it work. It appears to be playing a role, and you might be able to say more about this. It appears to be playing a role in bringing down the Prime Minister of Japan. It has become a very, very hot political issue. The Prime Minister has taken a position in favor of it and has gotten into a great deal of political conflict. It has created a major diplomatic row between the United States and Canada. And this is all before it has even hit the American political scene. And you can imagine that given the the contentious nature of American politics now, by later in the year when it becomes an issue in the United States, it's going to generate a lot of heat in the United States as well. So what is it? It's currently an agreement among 4 countries, Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, Singapore, reached in 2005, to which now the United States, Australia, Malaysia, Peru, and Vietnam have agreed to negotiate to expand into an agreement of 9 countries from 4. By the way, this was a proposal initially put forward by the Bush administration in its waning months in office. And then the Obama administration did not really say anything about trade policy for about a year, but then picked it up and now seems to be pursuing it quite aggressively. So it is ongoing. I have a fairly long series of slides, and I will skip most of them in order to make sure that this presentation ends tightly. So please bear with me as I skip some of the slides. This is a slide that shows what has happened to Asia-Pacific trade agreements over the past couple of decades. And I think it gives a fairly powerful insight into why the United States suddenly became enthusiastic and interested in this. As you can see, until about the year 2001, there were very few trade agreements in the Asia-Pacific. The red agreements, the tall bars, are agreements among countries in Asia. That is, they're either bilateral or multilateral, minilateral agreements among countries in Asia. The blue bars next to them are agreements between Asian economies and economies on the eastern side of the Pacific, either in Latin America or in North America. So as you can see, until about 2000, there was very little activity. Then very sharp increase, steady rise in the number of agreements. And the number of agreements involving primarily Asian countries were running roughly twice the level of those involving trans-Pacific or agreements that cross the Pacific. Today there are 37 of those agreements, and some of the statistics I will give you will be based on those 37 agreements. In the United States, this has raised two issues. Given that the Doha round has stalled, what we are clearly seeing is a shift to the bilateral and minilateral negotiating area. In that area, most of the agreements being made with our key trading partners in Asia are among they themselves, not including North America, and not including, for that matter, the other countries on the eastern shore of the Pacific. So they seem to be dividing, in a way, the Pacific into two halves. This is the famous Fred Bergsten fear that the agreements, if you permit them to go on their present course, would divide the Pacific in two. The US, by the way, is involved in only 3 of these 37 agreements currently. Australia, Singapore, and actually Korea is counted among these, the brand new agreement. So this is a kind of intellectual framework in which the discussion is now taking place in the United States. If you look at the significance of these agreements, and you can now look at the TPP, the P4 is the smallest circle at the bottom, roughly, I can't even remember what those numbers were, but they're under 3%. With the P4 partners, the current members of the P4 agreement, a couple of percent of US trade. The TPP-8, and by the way, this diagram was drawn before Malaysia decided to join the negotiation. That really should be the TPP-9 at this point. Currently concluded would still be a very small agreement, under 10% of US trade. Those two bars are exports and imports. But what the TPP has to be seen as is really, and this APEC made this formal in its discussions this year, and I think this has to figure into the conception of the American negotiators as they sit at the table. It's what it has to be seen at is a pathway to this larger Pacific agreement that we have been talking about for a very long time. FTAP is at the very end. If you move to the TPP 13, and that includes the next batch of countries, which would include Japan, it would include Korea, Malaysia, but also Mexico and Canada, one gets to be very close to half of US trade. And then as we move past that to FTAP, one would move to something like 2/3 of US trade today. But by the time that that agreement comes into force, possibly 2020, possibly 2025, that percentage is likely to grow still further because the countries that are represented in this larger circle are in fact the fastest growing economies in the world. So that's really what the TPP is about, and I will give you a slide here, why TPP, which lists some of the objectives that people have mentioned for it, and I think most of these really are beside the point or are of lesser relevance. To me, what it's really about is this very big idea of creating a Pacific-wide economic zone. It was an idea that Professor Kojima first started arguing for in the 1960s. It successively gave rise to a series of organizations, eventually APEC. Within APEC, it led to the FTAP idea, which is, of course, a very difficult one politically. But ultimately, that to me is the really big deal that the TPP could help us move toward in a practical way, in exactly the way that's different from what Michael mentioned, which is sitting down today with China, with Japan, with this very complex set of countries, very complex set of issues, and trying to solve all those problems at once in a difficult political environment. That's out of the question. TPP provides a pathway in which, hopefully, with a little bit of luck, a lot of luck,